Okay, in this video, I'd like to talk about space practice. And when we think about space practice, it highlights the point that, it's not just how we study that matters, but also the timing or when we study that is ultimately going to impact our learning. So again, this is a little bit different because we're not talking about a specific technique or specific strategy. We're talking about how we can kind of optimize the timing of our review to kind of maximize our long-term retention and learning. So it really comes down to kind of this idea of massed practice versus spaced practice. So when we talk about massed practice, it means studying in one long continuous session, right? So think of it as like, hey, I've been in a class, I haven't been studying, I haven't been reviewing, and then you find out, oh my God, the exam. You look at the syllabus and it's like the exam's tomorrow. I got to pull an all-nighter. So you spend 5 or 6 hours the night before kind of studying as much as you can in one mass session, right? That would be massed practice. So you can see in the top here, this is where, all of your review time is kind of chunked into one big block of time, right? And it's usually shortly before you need to take an exam. Again, this is the example of cramming, right? The alternative is kind of space practice, and that's where our studying is spread out over multiple sessions, kind of spaced out in time. So if you have an exam coming up, you may start a few weeks before, and instead of doing the ultra 6-hour sessions, you may break it up into 3 2-hour sessions, right? You're still spending 6 hours studying, but it's kind of spaced out in smaller chunks, right? And it seems like a subtle difference, right? Why does it matter if we study all in one time versus spreading it out? But there's a lot of research that tells us that space practice is much better for long-term retention. And it's probably the reason why you've probably been told since you were a little kid, don't cram. There is a basis for it, right? It actually spreading out our review sessions, helps us retain things, not just in the short term, but in the longer term, right? So the story of space practice really starts with Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he was a German psychologist who was really a pioneer in memory research and experimental psychology. So he did his work back in the 1800s, but a lot of his methods are still used today in psychology and educational psychology research. And a lot of the things that he learned through his own experiments, which a lot of times he just studied himself, what he could remember and things like that, what conditions affected his memory and those things, are still applicable today. He still gets referenced, and there's still studies that are being conducted to kind of validate his findings and stuff like that. So Dr. Ebbinghaus has certainly stood the test of time as far as the impact of his scientific work. So one of Ebbinghaus's main findings is what we call the forgetting curve, right? And so Ebbinghaus would do these kind of interesting experiments with himself. He would have these kind of nonsense words that he would try to memorize, right? They were just kind of 3-letter combinations that looked like words but really didn't have any real meaning, right? And so he would see how long he could memorize them. He would review a list and then he would test himself. And he'd say, how much can I remember after 1 day? How much can I remember after 2 days, 3 days? And what he noticed in a lot of his experiments, this is an oversimplification, but what he tended to notice is that we start to forget information very quickly. And it tends to occur very rapidly at first, right? So this is where we can describe that. We'll call that forgetting curve. So you can see on the y-axis, it's the amount of information that's retained. And on the x-axis, it's the time elapsed, let's just say in days. And the key things to note is that, much of what we have learned, we forget within, let's say, 1 to 2 days after we've learned it, right? So we forget a lot of what we're initially exposed to. So if you think of cramming, if I start studying the night before the exam, this is where we're at in the forgetting curve, right? We're actually going to start to forget a lot of the information that we've studied. And then when we go out to the exam, maybe a week or 10 days later, even though the exam is passed, we're still going to need that information moving forward. And this is where I think if you do a lot of cramming, you're going to start to notice that you just don't retain stuff, right? When you rely on cramming, it'll maybe get you through the exam, but you'll notice a week or 2 later when you've actually got to use that information for another course, or maybe you start getting questions when you're out on your clinical rotations or you start working with patients, you just probably won't feel like you actually carried much of it forward, right? So we want to work to interrupt the forgetting curve. So this is a depiction of what happens when we review, right? So this is when we first learn something, right? We see this kind of progressive forgetting curve, right? Where we progressively forget information over time. Now, if we review, so let's say we review after a day, right? This is when we review the material. we essentially can get ourselves back up to that full knowledge by reviewing. And the other thing that we do is we slow the rate of forgetting, right? So it buys us a little time, right? Because now after we've reviewed, we space it out in time, we're actually going to forget information at a slower rate, and it buys us some time where now we don't have to revisit it as soon, right? And then you notice as we keep reviewing, that rate of forgetting tends to get less and less, right? Where all of a sudden we get to the end, and after we've reviewed a few times, this is where we want to get to learn to as learners, because the information, our knowledge is pretty stable, right? Even if we don't review for a few days or even a week or 2 weeks, depending on, the specific information you may be trying to learn and how much you reviewed and how you reviewed, we get to a point where we forget information very slowly. And that's where we want to get to as learners, right? We want to get to the point where it's not just cram, remember it long enough to take the test and pass it, and then it's gone tomorrow, right? We want to get to the point where we learn it, forget a little bit, relearn it when we review, forget a little bit, relearn it when we review, forget a little bit, until the point where we don't need to review very often and we still tend to retain some of the key concepts, right? This is where we kind of get so that we space our review so that we can kind of interrupt this natural phenomenon of forgetting, right? So we'll look at the literature. We won't go into depth on these studies, but just some examples, right? There is some research that's contemporary in medical education that tells us that, spacing out the timing of our review can help us with our long-term retention, right? So there was a study by Kerfoot in 2007, and basically what they did was they looked at medical students. They learned some concepts. They went through some modules on different urology concepts. And for some of the modules on certain topics, they got weekly educational emails throughout the year. So every week they would get an email and it would have a question that they'd be asked. It was like kind of a scenario-based question. They would be asked to pull information forward from memory. So it's almost combining spacing, right? Revisiting information every week over time, and also some retrieval practice, pulling information from memory, which is beautiful if you can combine the two. And they looked at how those equally educational emails impacted student retention. And what they found is the topics that the students got those educational emails on that forced them to kind of revisit key concepts over time, they performed much better on a standardized exam than the concepts where they were taught it and then they never really revisited it. So it's kind of like they had never interrupted that forgetting curve, right? So it tells us that, hey, spacing out our review, revisiting concepts over time is really, really necessary for long-term durable learning, right? The other study I want to highlight is by Sprout, and it was a little more recent in 2014, but they wanted to look at space practice and its effect on learning certain laparoscopic surgery skills, right? So the reason I wanted to highlight this study is it's not just necessarily knowledge, knowledge retention that improves when we space out our studying and we build in opportunities for review over time. It also can help us with learning more psychomotor skills and technical skills, right? So what they found is that they had some students that basically learned these surgical skills all in one block, and then they were tested on it later. Other students had those training sessions where they learned those skills broken up into smaller chunks. So think of, the block, the mass practice would be maybe spending 6 hours learning these skills and practicing, whereas another group maybe spread it out, still 6 hours, but maybe 2 hours, 2 hours, 2 hours, right? And when they compared the groups, they noticed that the group that had some spacing into their practice, performed better as far as their technical skills. So, this will come up as if, you certainly want to build spacing into your kind of studying for your knowledge, right? But it's also a good thing to build in if you're learning certain technical skills like suturing, or if you're, a therapist and you're learning, some hands-on techniques to restore joint motion or something like that. You probably don't want to mass all your practice together. You probably want to still space it out over time. So again, these are just two of the many examples to highlight the benefits of spacing, right? I just picked these because I thought they'd be relevant to the people that were interested in these videos. So again, those teachers, probably starting when you're young all the way up into college professors that were always on you about don't cram, don't cram, don't cram, they were right? We miss out on a lot of key opportunities for learning when we kind of mass our study sessions together, right? So we want to avoid that if possible. So it's interesting to consider, why is spacing effective, right? Why does it matter how we time out and space this information? We don't really know for sure, but there are some ideas. One is that spaced practice involves more active recall. We talked about in the last video about how retrieval practice and active recall is a primer for learning and how powerful that can be. Well, you think of, if you study in one mass session, all of the information that you're going to be dealing with is kind of stored in your short-term memory. You have to pull it forward to be able to manipulate it, but once it's pulled forward and it's kind of at your disposal in your working memory, you don't have to go through that full retrieval process. Whereas if you break up your study sessions, or your review sessions, or if you're thinking psychomotor skills, your practice sessions, every time you sit down and have to revisit that material, it's like this process of going in and retrieving all the pertinent information from your memory. So there's more of that active recall when you kind of space out your practice or your studies or your review, right? Space practice also helps to limit mental fatigue. I think any of us who have crammed, which me included, and I've always regretted it, right? We've felt that, right? Where it's like you get to the point where you're maybe 2 hours in, maybe it's 30 minutes in, maybe it's 3 hours or 6 hours in, whatever it be, depending on probably the content. You get to the point where you just can't really effectively study anymore. You're kind of fried, right? So that's where it's like mental fatigue probably plays a big role, right? Chopping your studying up into smaller chunks probably lets you engage in the level of cognitive effort that it really takes to learn. The other idea is when we do spacing, usually we have bouts of sleep, right? Spread in through our study, like distributed in through our studying routine. And we know sleep is an amazing facilitator of learning, right? A lot of that changes in our neural system, happen when we're sleeping. Right, so we know that that's probably also playing a role here, is just having sleep interspersed between our study sessions, right? So how do you effectively build spacing into your routine, right? I've kind of told you, don't cram, right? And I'm guessing I'm not the first person you've heard that from, right? You've probably heard that from a lot of people. But how do you effectively build spacing in your routine? I think the key is to create a plan for when you'll study different topics. Right? If you just kind of say, I'm going to, study as I go, a lot of times you'll just end up getting close to the exam and you'll be like, wow, I haven't really spent any time on that topic, right? I have to cram. So the best way to prevent yourself from cramming is really to create a plan of when you're going to look at certain materials. And sometimes I found that kind of mixing old material with new material can be effective. Like, if I was going to class, I'll tell students this, instead of I would go to class, we'd get new content. Yes, I would study that, but maybe I'd start the session or end the session by going back and reviewing something that we had talked about previously in the course. So it was a nice way to say, yes, I want to stay on top of the new material that I've got in class today, but I'm also going to spend a little time going backwards and just brushing up on a small topic or something like that. The nice thing is, once you've reviewed a topic a couple times, you usually don't have to spend as much time on it, right? Because it's kind of just polishing it a little bit and things like that, because it takes less time to relearn something after it's been learned before, right? The other thing I would say is find the sweet spot for reviewing, right? The goal is if you want some forgetting to occur, right? You want to get to that point. So think of Ebbinghaus's forgetting curves and that figure I showed you of how we can interrupt forgetting. We want to get to the point where we've forgotten some, but not all of what we're trying to learn. If we've forgotten everything, like you haven't reviewed, you learned it, and then you haven't reviewed it in a year, you go back to it and it's like you never were exposed to it, right? It's like completely starting over. You don't want to get to that point, but you also probably isn't a good use of your time. If you know all the details, then it probably doesn't make sense to kind of keep working it into memory. You probably give yourself a little time, focus on other materials, and then come back to that topic after you've forgotten a little bit. So it's kind of the sweet spot. You want some forgetting to occur, but you don't want to have completely forgotten everything about a topic. There are also some programs that can help you, and a lot of them are free or at least have free options. Anki is one, RemNote's another option, and these are like, Anki is kind of a smart flashcard system where basically it will manipulate when you see different concepts based on how you're answering them. Like if it's asking you about a certain topic and you're like getting all the answers right, it'll say you probably don't need to review that for a while. So it's almost like it'll take your slides or your study materials and it'll shift it back in time and say, don't worry about that now. But if it's asking you, it's quizzing you, right? You're getting flashcards and you're not able to get the right answer. You're doing quiz questions, you're not able to get the right answer. You're looking at figures, you're not able to get, label them effectively and stuff like that. It'll say, well, don't put that information away for as long. Bring it more, spend more time reviewing that. And instead of you just having to do it, it'll kind of keep track of your performance and manipulate your study routine automatically. Like I said, it's something to play around with, but you can also do this without any kind of app or anything also. The other part here is pair retrieval practice and space practice, right? Because it doesn't have to be, I'm going to do recall or retrieval practice, or I'm going to do space practice or mass practice, right? The optimal study routine in my mind is optimal spacing. Make sure you're spacing out your study routine. And then when you are spending time studying, doing things that we know are effective, like active recall or retrieval practice, right? So it's, again, pairing this how we study, but also being mindful of when we study to optimize our learning, right? So again, key take home here is it's not just how we study, but again, also when we study. It's important to build spacing into your study routine. And just to be, give yourself some grace. Forgetting is natural, right? Any topic you try to learn, right? If you spend long enough time without kind of revisiting it or thinking about it or pulling information from memory or manipulating that information, you're kind of going to need to you're going to forget it. You're going to need to revisit it or in some cases completely relearn it. Forgetting is natural, right? Ebbinghouse's research work showed us that, right? It's a natural phenomenon. We can do things to disrupt it and delay it, but to some extent, you're always going to have things, even throughout your career, that you're just going to have to revisit when you need that information again and stuff like that. And it's important to give yourself a little grace. But the key point is, plan it out so that you don't get to the point where you're just cramming and moving on, that you give yourself a chance to, by the time you get done with the course, you've studied in a manner that information you're going to be able to carry forward into subsequent courses. And again, when you go out into your clinical rotations and things like that.
If you enjoyed this content, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Learning That Lasts, and check out my book, Learning That Lasts, which is available on Amazon.